Hey friends, it's Marie here from Nicole Designs. I have been playing around with my distress inks and my layering stamps, and I want to show you a technique that's super simple, gives you some watercolor effect stamping, and I think the use of this technique with these layering sets is just so much fun and gives you a really beautiful card. So I'm using Altenew's Beautiful Day stamp set. This is one of my favorite layering stamp sets from Altenew. It's just so very versatile, and I've used it so many ways. I've got all of my layering pieces lined up above my stamp platform, and I'm going to be taking them one at a time and showing you how to do sort of a watercolor stamping technique. So when you're doing layered stamping, you want to start with your solid image first, and you also want to start with your lightest color first. So I'm taking this Tattered Rose distress ink. It's a really light, sort of muted pink, like a vintage pink, and I think it's really pretty. I've paired this with a red and a few other browns to give it more of a vintage look. So you want to go ahead and put that distress ink on your stamp, and then I took a little spritz bottle and spritzed water over the top. Now, distress inks do react with water. You can use them to watercolor, mix them with water for a coloring medium. And so when you put the water on top of this distress ink, it starts to run and it gets really liquidy. So when you stamp it on your paper, it looks like you may have watercolored it. So if you're not all that great with freehand watercoloring like me, this is a really fun technique to kind of help you get a watercolor effect, a watercolor look, without it being super difficult. So in between each of these layers, I do like to take my heat tool and dry each layer, and that's because this distress ink, like I said, reacts with water. If you stamp it on each layer when it's wet, it's all just going to run together. You're not going to hold any of that detail when you're stamping, but if you dry it in between, you're going to be able to put those layers on top of each other. So I'm taking my next layer for my flower here, and I'm going to go a shade darker with my ink. I'm using some tea dye. Now this is more of a reddish kind of pinky brown. If you think of a cup of tea, that's kind of what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on my second layer, spritz it with my water here, and then go ahead and stamp it. Now I did want to notice or let you guys know that you can use a different amount of water. You can use a lot of water and get your ink really runny. You can use a little bit of water and kind of get more of a detailed, bold line when you're stamping. So really, depending on how much water you put on here depends on how runny and how loose your watercolor stamping is going to look. So I just encourage you to sit down and try this technique. Just have fun with it, get a feel for it and what kind of look you want. Every stamp and every layered image that you're going to do is going to look different because of that water. You can't really control where the water goes. You can to a certain degree, but watercolor is always going to kind of have its own mind, and so each stamp is really going to look unique. Now with my third layer here, I'm using aged mahogany. This is a really deep red, and I loved that with the lighter pink and the sort of reddish tints to the browns that I'm using. I think it really goes great for a fall palette or a vintage palette, and you can see now that I have that aged mahogany red on there, this flower is just starting to really pop off the page. It's looking so real, so vintage, and I love that mild watercolor effect that you get with this. Now the watercolor paper I'm using, I believe, is Arch's Hot Press. I could be wrong because I just grabbed it out of my stamps or my stash of paper. I think that's what it is, but you can use different papers. I've tried this on regular paper. Regular paper absorbs it a little more quickly. It doesn't let it kind of sit on the paper as long. You can use this on cardstock. I've done that as well. And if you're using a thinner paper, just use less water so it doesn't really make your paper warp and pill. But watercolor paper is a really great option for this technique as well. So my last layer here is the outline of my flower. You can do this layer if you want. You don't have to if you want it to look a little bit more loose. But I use some ground espresso, which is a dark brown. I didn't want to use black because I have all these brown vintage tones, and I thought black would just be too harsh with this flower, so I used that dark brown ground espresso, and I really love how this color combination came out. So it's tattered rose, tea dye, aged mahogany, and ground espresso. So I've gone ahead and I've done another flower here. I'm going to stamp this whole panel. It's all going to be watercolor stamping. It does take a little bit of time to get all of the layers on and dry all of the layers, but the results at the end really are stunning. So if you like to just sit down and stamp, this is a great technique to just relax with. So I'm taking my leaves now, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp my leaves out. Just like with my flowers, I'm using my lightest shade first. So this green that I put down here is a bundled sage. I think it's more of a muted green. Really helps with those brown tones with the flowers, and I thought it was just added to that vintage feel. I'm going to go ahead now with my second layer for my leaf, and I'm using Forest Moss. Now this one looks really green on the cap, but it actually has a little bit of a brown tone to it, which you'll see once I get it stamped, and I'm really going for those brown tones because I really want that vintage feel. So this was a perfect choice to go over my leaf, and I was thinking I might try this technique again, just stamping out maybe 1 or 2 layers, not all of the layers, and get more of a softer feel of stamping. There's just so many different things you can do with this technique that you can just sit down and play with and have fun. So my last layer for my leaves, again, is that ground espresso. I'm using that sort of as my outline color. Like I mentioned, I didn't want a dark black. I wanted this to really stick with that muted brown tones, and that finishes my leaf. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out this whole panel, arranging my flowers and my leaves just to fill up this card panel, and this is what it looks like when it's done. Now this is just simply the watercolor layered stamping, and I think it just looks gorgeous as a 1-layer card. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to add some splatters. So I'm taking some more of that tea dye, mixing it with some water, and I'm going to take a water brush and just flick on some little splatters, and I'm trying to keep it around the edges and keep the inside part pretty clear of splatter so I can put a sentiment there. But I'm hoping as you guys watch this, you can see how easy it is to do some layered stamping with this watercolor technique. It really adds something special to your card. It kind of makes it look like maybe you watercolored it when you didn't, which is perfect for me because I'm not all that great at watercoloring. Some people have asked about tips on how to line up your layered stamps. I think in another video I might talk more about that. With this watercoloring technique, it's really loose and not very precise anyway, so I kind of just eyeball where I think the layers go and I go with that, and you really can't tell at all with this watercolor technique if they are perfectly lined up or not. So I'm going to go ahead and adhere this front panel down to a craft cardstock base. I have trimmed down just a tiny bit off of each side, so I have a little bit of that craft peeking out, but I really wanted the whole front to be this beautiful watercolor scene here. I went ahead and I embossed one of the sentiments from that beautiful day stamp set in alabaster white embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, and I'm just going to pop it up on a little bit of foam tape, and that's going to finish the card. I really wanted all of those flowers to stand out, so I didn't want to add too much onto my card here. I wanted those flowers to be the star of this show, so just adding a simple sentiment on top of this card finished it off, and I hope this gave you some great tips on this watercolor technique. I think it's really fun to just sit down and play with. So if you guys have any questions, just leave them down below. Any comments? If you've tried this technique yourself before, I'd love to hear or see your examples. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by. That's all I have for you today. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up, give me a like, a comment, a share, subscribe if you haven't already. Just do all the things. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Bye.